The UN Declaration of Human Rights states that no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all of their forms.
In addition to slavery, the UN bans all that could harm humanity's right to life, liberty, and the security of home, all that could harm safe movement, work, and pay, the torture and degradation of another human, and the inequality of all people in dignity and rights.
Human trafficking is defined as the action or practice of illegally transporting people from one country or area to another, typically for the purposes of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. This violates the UN Declaration of Human Rights in a multitude of ways. Article 4 directly bans the act of slave trade, which includes human trafficking. The acts of sexual exploitation involved specifically in sex trafficking are forced and against the liberty of the victims. This treatment is the kind discussed in Article 5 of the Declaration, and is said to be prohibited. Why, who, and how are women susceptible to being put into the trafficking industry?
What society sometimes doesn't acknowledge is why and how women are being brought into the sex trafficking business. The women can have multiple vulnerabilities, such as debt, unstable immigration status, language barriers, lack of knowledge of laws in the United States, low education, shame, and so on, as told by Pilates' Human Trafficking and Elite Massage Businesses report. Traffickers lure women through false promises and deceptive job ads by exploiting their vulnerabilities. A common misconception of trafficked women is that they have a choice in the matter. But in reality, traffickers use manipulation and threats to keep their victims fearful and trapped.
Meanwhile, in foreign countries, especially in Southeast Asia, like Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, women are brought to the United States under the impression of starting a new career. For these women, the prospects of an American golden opportunity entrances them to pay significant sums for their transport, only to be forced and exploited into brothels on their arrival to the U.S. Take, for example, Chandra Wawarantu, a single woman with a 3-year-old daughter, an elderly mother, and a determined mind and heart to bring extra cash to her family during hard times, who came to the U.S. under the impression of beginning to work in the hotel hospitality industry. Her only requirements: to speak English, and a recruitment payment equivalent of $2,700 US. These debts, like that paid by Wawarantu to her traffickers, cause employees to risk economic bankruptcy, only to become indentured servants, required to work off insurmountable payments to their traffickers.
Upon arrival to JFK International Airport, Wawarantu was driven to various locations where her traffickers would change cars and exchange money, and ultimately to a house in Queens, where she saw a 13-year-old girl beaten by a group of men, and while at gunpoint, was forced to have sex. Chandra Wawarantu, the single mother who came to America with the hopes of earning extra cash to allow her daughter and mother to be raised in comfort, had been trafficked. Only a few hours upon her arrival to the U.S., she was forced to have sex.
Demographically, victims range from all races, but a substantial majority come from low-income areas, especially in condensed urban areas. Trafficking affects the socioeconomically unfortunate through systematic targeting by pimps. These traffickers are able to coerce specific groups through psychological torment and manipulation. In the United States, the top cities for the human trafficking industry per capita are Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Georgia, and Orlando, Florida. The people most affected as victims are runaways and homeless children. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, a Chicago study found that 56% of trafficked women were initially runaway youth. These victims are susceptible to corrosion due to lack of support from family figures or are unfamiliar to their environments.
In addition to runaways, pimps and traffickers target those with psychological trauma and mental illness. They focus their attentions towards victims of war, domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and social discriminations due to their susceptibility and weakness. Pimps in the U.S. depend on manipulation to lure young girls and women into sex trafficking rings. They begin by giving the victims a sense of protection and love. Pimps usually take on a fatherly figure in the eyes of young girls or a love interest to older victims. The girls often fall for the act and begin to believe they're in love or are taken care of because of the attention they get from their trafficker.
Pimps look for advantages and vulnerabilities of young girls and women and use that to lure them into the life of sex trafficking. Shamir McKenzie was a college student struggling with her tuition in 2005. She first came face to face with her pimp, who lured her into a relationship. His first move was to offer a job idea of dancing for money and living in his apartment. Her trafficker assured Mackenzie that she would not have any physical contact with the customers. Once back at the pimp's house, Mackenzie continued dancing for men, but was in shock when one of them demanded oral sex. The man Mackenzie thought cared about her then began choking her when she started yelling at the customer. Eventually, her refusal to the man meant nothing. Mackenzie had unknowingly found herself trapped into prostitution.
These Romeos, a term used in the sex trafficking industry to refer to traffickers who rely solely on the psychological manipulation of their victims to gain their trust. This infatuation with their traffickers allows these Romeos to bring their victims slowly and unexpectedly into the industry.
But Romeos aren't the only secret term traffickers use to hide their practices. A wide variety of trafficking vocabulary is used. Guerrilla or guerrilla pimps are those that are known to kidnap their victims and beat them into submission, rather than the gradual coercion of Romeo pimps.
Seasoning is a term that pimps use to psychologically torment their victims, or in some cases beat, isolate from family and friends, commit sodomy or gang rape, or threaten the victim's family or children to gain submission.
Customers who purchase sex are known as Johns, and their transactions simply tricks.
From these trafficking rings, hierarchies form as a means of controlling their victims. A bottom may emerge from a ring acting as the pimp's right hand, instructing victims and purchasing hotel rooms, or even delivering punishments to those who do not meet their quotas. These hierarchical communities are known commonly as stables.
These hierarchies create dangerous loyalties between victim and pimp, enabling a sense of Stockholm Syndrome in the victims, in which the means of life lies solely in the trafficker.
These families create toxic bonds and dependencies within stables. The victims have set monetary quotas and are forced to perform sex acts to meet them. These quotas are brought either directly from the victim or indirectly through a bottom to the financial benefit of the pimp. The pimp then provides alleged security and safety for the victim.
Stables are tightly woven and are often intertwined with other pimps to form multi-state circuits. The removal of one prostitute from the stable could lead to catastrophe for the pimp, and so the coercion and manipulation of his victims are paramount to their remaining in the rings. This manipulation may keep stables intact, but the costs of maintaining economic prestige are at the physical and mental health of the victims. The balance falls indefinitely to the pimp.
More often than not, The fragile lives of prostitutes are seen as voluntary, sinful, and illegal. When taken from a closer point of view, however, these victims are just the opposite. These women are subjected to psychological torment and physical beatings, unpayable debts, and illegal methods of paying them, and are forced to perform acts that degrade moral compass and self-image.
Why do they stay? These women are forced to endure harsh conditions as a result of physical and psychological manipulation by their oppressors. They have been convinced that their only means of survival is through performing sex acts, that their relationship is symbiotic, romantic, economic, or even paternal, rather than its parasitic reality. They join sex rings unknowingly, finding security and solace in their pimps. By the time they realize their imprisonment, they are too late to escape.
But it is not too late to help these victims. The Teens End to Sex Trafficking is a student-run organization dedicated to the abolition of these enslaved victims. These groups of women are oppressed, and many will never find the means of escape, never leaving the toxic cycle of prostitution. Help us end sex trafficking in the United States. Help us end sex trafficking. For good.